Thank you very much, Diane, for the introduction. I'd like to do what Diane did, which is talk for a little while and then open it up for questions. So if you have a question before then, please do write it down so you'll remember when the time comes. Here at the Disability Rights Leadership Institute on Bioethics, we're looking at many issues where the disability movement's perspective is at serious risk of being lost in the tumult of other views and interests and prejudices in society. The legalization of assisted suicide may be one of the biggest ones that come up as proposals for major public policy change regularly and often, by which I mean that there are bills, initiatives, and lawsuits to legalize assisted suicide in at least a few states, sometimes more, every year. Almost all are defeated. Some come close to becoming law, usually with strenuous opposition from a number of groups that I'll talk about a little bit later, and rarely, but sometimes, one in fact does become law, I hate to say. So have you figured out yet which side we're on? I'm glad that came across as a joke. That's what it was. While many people know that Oregon, Washington State, and last year Vermont have legalized assisted suicide, it is less well known that about half the states in the United States have either defeated bills to legalize it or have passed laws explicitly banning it. What they've banned, what assisted suicide when legalized is, and it's not that easy to say simply, but I'll do my best, is making it legal for a doctor, generally speaking a doctor, to prescribe lethal drugs, often thought of as an easy, simple, single pill to swallow, but actually not so, not at all. It's actually a very onerous thing to do to someone who theoretically is terminally ill and requests it. It alters long-standing state laws that in essence say it's illegal for anyone, a doctor or anyone else, to take an action to cause death. In many cases, the bills or referenda are defeated due to the efforts of an opposition coalition spanning the political spectrum from left to right. These coalitions typically represent disability rights organizations, physicians and other healthcare workers, hospice organizations, and Catholic and other right-to-life organizations. In some cases, they also include organizations representing the Latino community, poor people, and workers. And that's just how far we've been able to organize so far. There's a lot more potential. And of course, quite a few highly recognized national disability rights organizations are on record in opposition, including ADAPT, including several independent living organizations, which include NICL, the National Council on Independent Living, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, DREDF, where I work, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, the National Council on Disability, and of course not dead yet, and the World Institute on Disability. The opposition to the legalization of assisted suicide is often mischaracterized as driven exclusively by religious conservatives. But most current opposition coalitions include many people and organizations whose opposition is based on their progressive politics. Other key opponents to legalizing assisted suicide include the American Medical Association, that's the AMA, and their state affiliates, the World Health Organization, the American College of Physicians, the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, the American Cancer Society, and the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC. Many prominent Democrats and liberals also oppose legalization, including Bill Clinton, Ralph Nader, and noted civil liberties journalist Nat Hentoff. Supporters of legalization focus on superficial issues of choice and determination. It is crucial to look deeper. Legalizing assisted suicide would not increase choice and self-determination. It would actually augment real dangers that negate genuine choice and control. More on that later. When we work against assisted suicide proposals, we must, in a way, ask people to separate their private wishes for what many of them may hope to have available for their individual selves someday, a hope that, in many ways, misunderstands or fails to understand how assisted suicide actually operates, and instead to look at the significant dangers of legalizing assisted suicide as public policy in our society as a whole because of its many unintended consequences. So, like many issues in the disability rights movement, our view asks people to shift their view from seeing this as a medical issue for a single individual and seeing people separate and one by one, and rather see how it affects society as a whole, that is, all people. Polls show that the more the public considers assisted suicide, the less they like it. I can give you more details about that, so feel free to ask during the Q&A. A couple more introductory thoughts. To effectively defeat proposals to legalize assisted suicide, we need to talk about one state in particular, and that is Oregon, which provides proponents their model and where assisted suicide has been legal for real since 1997. Because otherwise, proponents will respond to every argument that we make with, and I quote, "But that problem that you're describing has not materialized in Oregon." So you will hear a lot of talk today about Oregon. One last point of introduction. I'm not going to have time to cover the intense politics of terminology on assisted suicide, the hot debate about what things are called. Feel free to ask that too in the Q&A period, but what I will say is that we use the term assisted suicide. We don't use the euphemisms of the proponents. They are usually two things they say. One is, quote unquote, aid in dying, which could mean anything. I have a colleague who says that that could include plumping the pillow and mopping the brow. So, and the other term they like to use is, quote unquote, death with dignity, a term that is so offensive on so many levels, we could spend all day. We, that is, opponents of legalization, have also begun to introduce an additional term to call it by, which I will use at times today to make it become more familiar to people. That is a term, doctor-prescribed suicide. And we use that because that's what it is. And it means the same thing. Okay. As I move into the real stuff here, I just want to check with you. Everyone's hearing me. It's not too loud. It's not too soft. The volume is good. Okay. The movement for the legalization of assisted suicide is driven by anecdotes of people who suffer greatly in the period before they die. But the overwhelming majority of these anecdotes describe either situations for which legal alternatives exist today, or situations in which the individual would not be legally eligible for doctor-prescribed suicide anyway. It is legal now in every U.S. state to receive sufficient palliative care, that is comfort care, including painkillers, to be comfortable. This is an area where U.S. healthcare has improved a lot, though not enough. And today we know that robustly prescribed painkillers at the end of life will not hasten death. Really, that is a myth. That taking lots of painkillers hastens death is a myth. Let me encourage you, if you want to see the facts behind it, to look at the recommended reading on that reading list that you have on the website by Drs. Herbert Hendon and Kathleen Foley from Michigan Law Review, and search for the term "does not hasten death." But most important and least understood, for anyone who is dying in pain, it is currently legal in every U.S. state to receive what is called palliative sedation, which is when the dying person is sedated to unconsciousness if necessary, to the point where discomfort is relieved during the dying process until he or she dies peacefully due to their underlying medical condition, not due to the sedation. So knowing about palliative sedation often makes a lot of people realize that assisted suicide does not need to be legalized because of the other options that we have. So there's already a legal recourse for painful deaths that does not involve the serious problems of legalizing assisted suicide. Let's move into reasons we have against the legalization of assisted suicide that relate specifically to the disability community. So I asked the rhetorical question, why are we against this seemingly benign and merciful thing? Well, I want to start with the disability-related objections, given who we are. Now, there's a lot of other reasons as well, reasons that affect everybody. And when we're the ones who are fighting a bill or an initiative or some such thing that would legalize assisted suicide, we really need to give the entire spectrum of the arguments, because often in state coalitions and the like, fighting assisted suicide bills or initiatives, we might be the only ones making a cogent spectrum of arguments. I've been there, I've seen it, I know. Ironically, the very disability prejudice that permeates the society, which is so key to everything that we're talking about for these 2 days, that prejudice can make the general public, unfortunately, less responsive to the reasons that are specifically disability related. And so we use both sets of reasons, and there's not really a clear distinction between them, but we use both sets of reasons, including the general public reasons, because even though they affect the disability community a lot, though you may never use the word disability when you explain them. Diane, I wanted to say, and the reason we use all of those arguments is because if our goal is to win, rather than simply to be right, if our goal is to defeat the bill or referendum or to convince the judge of the lawsuit that assisted suicide is not a good idea, we need to use all the arguments, including those that most move the public. But I'm going to start with the ones that are clearly affecting the disability community. Diane laid the basis for many of these. For example, the story of Elizabeth Bouvier and the story of Larry McAfee and the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death cases that clued the disability community in that there was something here that we needed to be paying attention to. And the fact that these things spread from people who are terminally ill to a much broader swath of people. And the fact that there's so much prejudice about people's quality of life. Like it's such a terrible thing to have a feeding tube. And how, well, I hardly have to say, we all saw the prejudice right in front of us. And how healthcare workers, who are theoretical experts, have such a difference in their view of our quality of life than we do. So I want to talk about the four that we really haven't talked about today. The first one is I'm going to call suicide prevention versus suicide assistance. And I'm just simply going to read, because in a very stunning and highly original analysis, our own Diane Coleman wrote in a chapter for a book about 10 years ago now, maybe more, that the public image of severe disability as a fate worse than death becomes grounds for carving out a deadly exception to long-standing laws and public policies about suicide intervention services. By that we mean suicide prevention services. And that was me. Let me go back to Diane. And legalizing assisted suicide. Legalizing assisted suicide means that some people who say they want to die will receive suicide intervention, that is prevention, while others will receive suicide assistance. Some will receive help to stay alive. Others will receive help to die. The difference between these two groups of people will be their health or disability status, leading to a two-tiered system that results in death to the socially devalued group. Does that say it all, or what? And I want to now go, and I'll read this slide quickly while we look at the graphic. This cartoon shows a wheelchair user in front of a suicide prevention program with many steps up to the door. But around the corner, there's a big wheelchair ramp leading to another door labeled assisted suicide. The two-tiered system, and this graphic was created, by the way, by Amy Hasbrook, who is here today, and you'll hear from her later. Okay, disability-related objection number 2. Consider the Netherlands. Doctor-prescribed suicide began to be legally tolerated in the Netherlands in the early 70s. Let me quote a gentleman named Dr. Herbert Hendon, who is an international expert on suicide prevention. He wrote that the Netherlands has moved from assisted suicide to euthanasia, meaning lethal injections. So from something an individual does to something the doctor does. From euthanasia for the terminally ill to euthanasia for the long-term chronically ill. From euthanasia for physical illness to euthanasia for psychological distress only. And from voluntary euthanasia to non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. Once the Dutch accepted assisted suicide, it was not possible legally or morally to deny more active measures, assistance to die, to euthanasia or euthanasia to those who could not effect their own deaths. Nor could they deny assisted suicide or euthanasia to the chronically ill who, it was argued, have longer to suffer than the terminally ill, or to those who have psychological pain completely not associated with any physical disease. To do so was seen as a form of discrimination. Involuntary euthanasia, that is when the person has not asked for it, possibly is not able to ask, back to Dr. Hendon, has been justified as necessitated by the need to make decisions for patients not intellectually competent to choose it for themselves. Unquote. Though there are some people in the United States who resist learning any lessons from outside our borders, there is actually quite a bit to be learned. The Netherlands shows the slide towards broadening the so-called strict restrictions on the legalization of assisted suicide. Let's do one more and take some questions before we break for lunch. Terminal illness prognosis, a fundamental loophole. Now this one is really both disability-related and broadly related to the entire population. The Oregon and Washington laws are based on the faulty assumption that it's possible to make a clear distinction between those who are terminally ill with 6 months to live and everybody else. Everybody else is supposedly protected and not eligible for doctor-prescribed suicide. But the hitch is that it is extremely common for medical prognoses of a short life expectancy to be wrong. Studies overwhelmingly show how many errors are made, often predicting death when people may live for decades. This situation may lead people to give up on treatment and lose good years of their lives. We've got a big group of people here today. A lot of them are people with disabilities. How many of you have at one time or other had a terminal prognosis, that you were terminally ill? I see a hand over here. I see a hand 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have, just in this room, at least 8 people who've had that prognosis. Okay, how many of you have outlived it for a long time? Roughly the same hands. And for how long have you outlived it? Just yell it out. I'll say it into the mic. 50 years. 32 years. 13. 50. 35. 30. We're going to be like, in the thousands if we keep going. And how many of you know somebody who has long outlived a terminal illness or terminal prognosis? We now have nearly the entire room. Let's talk about Jeanette Hall of Oregon, who was diagnosed with cancer in the year 2000 and told she had 6 months to a year to live. She was in Oregon. Oh, I said so. She knew about the assisted suicide law, and she asked her doctor about it because she didn't want to suffer. Who can blame her? Her doctor encouraged her not to give up, and ultimately she decided to fight the disease. She had both chemotherapy and radiation. It's now something like 15 years later, and Jeanette wrote in a letter to the editor, quote, "I am so happy to be alive. If my doctor had believed in assisted suicide, I would be dead. I thank him and all my doctors for helping me. Assisted suicide should not be legal." Unquote. But the hitch, again, there's a hitch, is that not everybody's doctor is like Jeanette Hall's. Now, all of this proposes considerable danger to people with new or progressive disabilities or diseases, who may often be misdiagnosed as terminally ill, but who may, in many cases, outlive these prognoses by years or decades. Research overwhelmingly shows, what we've learned in our own little room today, big room, thank God it's a big room, research overwhelmingly shows that people with new disabilities frequently go through initial despondency and suicidal feelings, but later adapt well and find great satisfaction in our lives. Anybody? I can vouch for that. It happened to me. Anybody else did that happen to? Okay, I see lots of hands. However, that adaptation period usually takes considerably longer than the mere 15-day waiting period required by many assisted suicide proposals and the Oregon and Washington state laws. So in that early period before one learns the truth about how good your quality of life can be, it's all too easy, if doctor-prescribed suicide is legal, to make the final choice one that is irrevocable. I was going to tell a story, but I actually want to take some questions before lunch, but I'll abbreviate the story. I was going to tell a story about a colleague of mine, Dr. Richard Radke, who, with a very significant disability, became an academic oceanographer. He was from Hawaii, and he finally, after many years, passed away in 2012. Richard had very significant muscular sclerosis for over 30 years. He was often misdiagnosed as terminal. He was very depressed for 2 years. Had assisted suicide been legal, he would have chosen it and died long, long ago. Notwithstanding, he has a more significant disability to the extent that you can tell from the outside more than anybody I've seen here today. He had a very successful academic career, was a happily married father. In retirement, he ran a charitable foundation. And I have to ask, how many people like Dr. Radke is our society prepared to sacrifice as collateral damage from the legalization of assisted suicide? So We were talking about disability-related issues, and I'd never like to close this subject without looking at the issue of the danger to people with depression and psychiatric disabilities. Because I think people with disabilities really assume that the disability-related constituencies by assisted suicide has to do with people that are very physically, visibly disabled. And I think the most insidious threat is actually to people with depression and psychiatric disabilities. I still feel too loud. What happened to that volume dial? It vanished. Okay. No, there's a real dial, an actual dial. I operated it this morning. Oh, is it? Does anyone see it? Thank you so much. There we go. Testing, testing. Yeah, I know. No. Well, it's for the public system. No, it is. Listen. Okay, maybe not. All right. So doctors are very often unable to diagnose depression. Yet psychological assessments in Oregon and Washington State are not required by the law. And even when they occur, they are defined as a single visit. Moreover, a doctor who thinks a patient should receive lethal drugs can shop for a psychologist or psychiatrist who will make a finding the doctor agrees with. My favorite doctor source, Herbert Hendon, once said, "A request for assisted suicide is usually made with as much ambivalence as are most suicide attempts. If the doctor does not recognize that ambivalence, as well as the anxiety and depression that underlie the patient's request for death, the patient may become trapped by that request and die in a state of unrecognized terror." Volume-wise? I just realized that I didn't ever turn the real slideshow on. Okay, thank you. Most cases of depression among terminally ill people can be successfully treated, yet primary care physicians are generally not experts in diagnosing depression. When assisted suicide is legalized, the depression remains undiagnosed, and the only treatment consists of a lethal prescription. How many of you had a chance to read about Michael Freeland, who had a 40-year history of acute depression, but received lethal drugs in Oregon? I see a few hands, a few hardy readers. When provided high-quality medical and social services, his desire for doctor-prescribed suicide vanished. There are many other reasons that impact everybody, but you never hear the word disability when you explain them. And one is the myth, free choice, and self-determination. Assisted suicide proponents have a mantra. Their mantra is free choice and self-determination. They have it all over the world. Thank you, Liz, for showing us that. But in reality, legalizing doctor-prescribed suicide actually diminishes individual choice and control, particularly in situations of family disharmony and abuse. Margaret Dorr, an elder law specialist from Oregon, has written, "The assisted suicide laws in Oregon and Washington State, on which every policy proposal we see are based, allow an heir, an H-E-I-R heir, who will benefit from the patient's death through a financial inheritance to help the person sign up for the lethal dose. Once the lethal dose is issued by the pharmacy, there is no oversight. No witness is required when the lethal drugs are taken. Let's say the patient changes her mind or isn't ready. Someone else putting the lethal dose in the patient's feeding tube or IV nutrition bag can't be prevented. The abuser can apply an alternate method like suffocation, even if the patient struggled. Who would know? Her lethal request provided an alibi. There is also danger that people choose assisted suicide due to external pressure. elderly people who don't want to be a financial or caretaking burden on their families. The percentage of reported Oregon cases attributed to patients' reluctance to burden their families has risen shockingly from 12% in 1998 to up to 45% in 2007, already 7 years ago. I should have checked to see what it is today. I hope not bigger, but it might be. It is bigger. The numbers are getting worse all the time, but for me, what comes across are the stories. Washington State legalized assisted suicide much later than Oregon. Their first individual who used that law, or who was reported to use that law, died a couple of years later, something like '09. Rob Miller, who was director of the pro-assisted suicide group Compassion and Choices, we'll talk more about them in a minute, he commented on the death of Linda Fleming. When asked if he knew that Fleming, who was divorced, had had financial problems, had been unable to work due to the new onset of a disability, and was forced to declare bankruptcy in '07, Miller said he was unaware of all of those facts, yet her case presented, quote, none of the red flags that would cause his organization to reconsider supporting her suicide request. So those are the people who are the cheering squad for legalization. Another big issue that concerns us is what we call the deadly mix, the danger, the deadly combination of legalizing assisted suicide with our broken, profit-driven healthcare system. Even with the Affordable Care Act, or so-called Obamacare, which my organization supports, we still have a deadly mix with assisted suicide. The cost of the lethal medication generally used to cost $100, it was $300, it's still well under $1,000. Definitely the cheapest treatment available, much less than the cost of treating any long-term medical condition. Direct coercion is not even necessary. If insurers deny or even merely delay approving life-sustaining treatment, many individuals might be steered toward assisted suicide. Do we think profit-driven health insurers will do the right thing or the cheap thing? What do you think? Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroop, Oregonians with cancer, were both informed by the Oregon Health Plan that the plan wouldn't pay for their chemotherapy, but would pay for their assisted suicide. Though called a free choice for these patients, assisted suicide was a phony form of freedom. Okay, I'm going to read this explanation while we look at this cartoon, just to show you that we're not the only ones this notion has occurred to. Here's a cartoon of a healthcare executive at his desk commenting to a colleague in letters probably too small for you to read. Quote, we're able to hold down healthcare costs through assisted suicide. There's some other failed safeguards in the Oregon law. A number of them we've already talked about. One of them is that Oregon's scheme is highly regulated and has strong safeguards. Well, it has very porous so-called safeguards. Some of them we've talked about, and here are a few more. An important one, a famous one, is doctor shopping. Shopping for a different doctor can get around any so-called safeguard. Take the example of Kate Cheney, an elderly woman with cancer whose doctor said no to her request for lethal drugs due to her increasing dementia and concern about pressure from Cheney's adult daughter. But the family found another doctor, and Kate Cheney soon died. By the way, the law does not require doctors who are experts in end-of-life care. 2 Botox dermatologists could start a clinic for doctor-prescribed suicide. But it gets worse. It's common knowledge in Oregon that if your doctor says no to your request for a lethal agent, call the organization Compassion and Choices. They are the boosters, the ideological supporters of legalization, and they'll refer you to doctors who don't say no. Look at how a few doctors have prescribed the vast percentage of Oregon's reported assisted suicides. Dr. Peter Goodwin, Compassion and Choice's former medical director, said that about 75% of those who died using Oregon's doctor-prescribed suicide law through the end of 2002 did so with the organization's assistance. In 2003, that went up to 79%. Referrals through Compassion and Choices. And in 2008, their proportion was up to 88%. And as long as we're on that organization, Compassion and Choices, well, all I can say is there's a lot in a name. But this particular name is held by the same group that, before a number of mergers and splits, used to be called the Hemlock Society. The thing they're best at is PR. I want to move on to one other safeguard, so-called, the good faith standard. It is a safeguard that works. It's the first one I know of that does. However, unfortunately, it doesn't work for patients, but rather for doctors. Oregon and Washington state laws legalize negligence by the good faith provision, which states that no practitioner will be liable unless you act in good faith, if you act in good faith, something nearly impossible to disprove, which makes all the other safeguards effectively unenforceable. Everything else doctors do, they're liable if they're negligent. With doctor-prescribed suicide, even if negligent, the practitioners cannot be found violating the law as long as they practice in good faith. And credit to Amy Hasbrook for this slide. So those are some of the so-called safeguards that legislators are persuaded to think will help their constituents stay safe. There's another big dimension that we need to know about, and that is how negligible the research, the reporting, and the oversight is on the assisted suicide program out of Oregon. Their annual reports, their vaunted statistical reports, actually show us very little. In reality, we don't know what's happening on the Oregon law. For one thing, the reporting requirement lacks teeth. Doctors fail to report prescribing lethal drugs, face no penalty. Reporting is required on paper, but no investigations take place to ensure the reports are made. Also, noncompliance is not monitored. The state of Oregon does not monitor underreporting, noncompliance, or violations. And many of their reports clearly acknowledge that the state cannot confirm compliance with the law. 3, important questions don't go unasked. The state does not talk to doctors who denied requests to prescribe lethal drugs, nor, these doctors who first said no may have viewed the patients as not meeting the legal requirements. Important information if one wants to evaluate the law's outcomes. Nor does the state talk to families. D, no investigation of abuse. The state has neither the resources nor even the authority to investigate violations. All of the abuses that we've discussed, Michael Freeland with his depression, Kate Cheney with her increasing dementia, or Wendy Melcher, only the media have brought them to light, not an oversight body whose job it should be. 5th, no autopsies are required, opening the door to another Dr. Kevorkian, most of whose victims were not terminally ill. Pardon my language, but how many people here are old-timers who fought against what Dr. Jack Kevorkian from Michigan was doing? Oh, I see. I must see 10 hands or more, 15. Thank you to the people who have fought all these years. And the last point I wanted to mention, the underlying data in Oregon is destroyed annually. Most egregious of all, the state of Oregon has acknowledged that after each annual report is published, the underlying data is destroyed. So no outside party can conduct objective research. Now, that is not required by the law, but for whatever reason, they've admitted that they do it. So doctor-prescribed suicide is practiced in Oregon in secret and without oversight. In this lax contest, we must assume that any abuses that come to light are just the tip of the iceberg. Let's take your remaining questions about assisted suicide. I want to then make a few points about the political landscape surrounding assisted suicide and show you a short film, which I think is very entertaining, and then maybe we can squeeze in a break before our afternoon groups. In addition to what we've already talked about, the political landscape in the U.S. today includes groups like this. Instead of working to legalize assisted suicide, they skirt the laws against it, and they help people one by one to kill themselves with things like plastic bags over their heads. And then if the individual changes their mind, the Final Exit Network volunteers hold their hands down. Is that ghoulish or what? There have been some prosecutions of people in these groups for violating laws against assisted suicide. Another factor in the surroundings is that the group, the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, our friend on so many issues, has not been our friend on this one. On the state level, they are usually pro-legalization. And before I ended and showed you this fun movie, I wanted to talk a little bit more about cross-constituency coalitions. So a word about these, another name for them is multi-constituency coalitions. For example, I've worked for years with Californians Against Assisted Suicide, and we've seen similar coalitions in many states. I want to address some of the possibly controversial realities, really the elephant in the room, even though it may conceivably make some people uncomfortable. So here I go. I'm not asking anybody to identify themselves, so there's no need to raise your hands on this one. But here's some thoughts for those of us, of you or of us, who consider yourselves liberals or somewhere on the left. While not universal, I think that most disability rights advocates in the United States think of ourselves that way, including me. A lot of us are surprised, and some of us are, in fact, quite uneasy to find that our closest allies in working against legalization are right-to-life groups and other groups that are faith-based. It's important to remember all the groups we talked about at the beginning that also oppose legalization. The AMA, the League of United Latin American Citizens, groups like that from the political center. But they're often forgotten, the media ignore them, and disability groups are alleged to be somehow under the misleading influence of the Catholic Church, or else a tool of the ultra-right. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I know no disability advocates who are tools of the right wing. I have yet to meet one. Just as often, we're simply ignored. That is common. It can be a real challenge in some states to get our opposition, the disability opposition, taken seriously. It takes real work to get the reporters out of their stereotypes and out of their ruts. And all of these things can be challenges. Even so, most of the time, the only way to successfully beat back proposals to legalize assisted suicide depends on our ability to form multi-constituency coalitions, also known as single-issue coalitions, where each group leaves its other issues at the door and come together to work on one thing, defeating the legalization of assisted suicide. And further, it's a key strategy in these coalitions that the people who speak to the press, who testify to the legislature, who are in the public view, must be those of us without right-wing baggage. So primarily the disability community and the medical community, doctors, nurses, and so forth. And this is not because we don't like certain groups and we like others, because it is simply the politics of winning on this issue. And if we don't stick to this approach, I will put it this way, if we don't stick to this approach religiously, oh, I can tell you're still listening. We play into the hands of the proponents who would love everyone to think that we are, in fact, a tool of the right wing. I well understand that not every disability advocate is comfortable working in these multi-constituency coalitions. It may be a tough job, but somebody is going to need to do it. When working on this issue, everybody wants to tell you stories of their family members' deaths, and we listen respectfully, whether the facts of that person's death support the proponents or the other side. And we never dismiss these crucial and heartfelt stories of what these people have been through in their family. And we don't say, well, there's other ways your family member could have committed suicide. We don't win any points that way. There's plenty of time to make our points if we start early.